There is a moment in almost every ancient archive where the ink changes. Not the handwriting, not the language, not the century. The ink changes, becomes thinner, more careful, more deliberate, and the historian who had just spent 40 lines describing a siege, naming every general, cataloging every wound, suddenly becomes vague, suddenly becomes abstract, suddenly reaches for words like corruption, like indecency, like practices too shameful to name in full, and then moves on, as if nothing had been withheld, as if silence were a form of completeness. But silence is never neutral. Silence is always a decision. Someone made a choice about what the future would know. Someone sat with a reed pen or a quill or a copying brush and decided not what to record, but what to leave behind the curtain, what to gesture toward without touching, what to protect and what to erase, and whether those two things were ever really different. This is a history of that silence, not of the acts themselves, because the acts themselves may be less revealing than the pattern of their disappearance, not of scandals uncovered or rituals exposed, but of something far stranger and far more instructive, the deliberate, systematic, carefully constructed omission. The moment ancient writers looked directly at something and chose, with full awareness, not to see it. What they avoided tells us everything, not just about the ancient world, about power, about who writes history, about why certain truths survive the centuries, and why others were considered too dangerous to even fully name. We begin with a simple question, though the answer is not simple at all. Who wrote the ancient world down? When we speak of ancient historians, the ones whose works we still read, whose names appear in university syllabi, whose sentences have been copied and recopied across 2,000 years, we are speaking of a very specific kind of person, not an archivist, not an investigator, not a dispassionate observer. We are speaking of elite men writing for elite men, men who had survived the social hierarchy long enough to have access to materials, to patrons, to time, and to the particular kind of reputation that came with being trusted as a recorder of civilization. This matters more than it sounds, because when you are writing for an audience of your peers, men of equivalent station, equivalent assumptions, equivalent moral frameworks, your writing is not neutral documentation. It is reputation management. It is social performance. It is a negotiation between what you know and what is acceptable to be known as someone who wrote it down. Thucydides understood the chaos of war because he lived it. Tacitus understood the corruption of empire because he navigated it daily. Suetonius recorded the private behavior of emperors with something approaching relish, but even Suetonius, who seemed to delight in scandal, became slippery around certain categories of behavior. Even the writers who appeared to revel in disclosure had invisible edges, points at which the hand grew careful, at which the language became ornamental rather than precise.
The ancient world was not a world without self-awareness about what it committed to permanence. Writing was not cheap, it was not quick, it was not impulsive. Every papyrus scroll, every wax tablet, every carved stone required intention, required resources, required someone, somewhere, deciding that this particular thing was worth the cost of making it last. And what that cost created, what that intentionality produced, was a record shaped not only by what happened, but by what the people holding the pen believed should survive. That is not a small distinction. It is, in fact, everything. Look at the language, not the content, the language. Ancient historical texts are full of a particular vocabulary of avoidance. You find it across cultures, across centuries, across languages that share no common root. You find it in Roman Latin, in Greek, in Sanskrit commentary, in early Chinese historiography, in the chronicles of Islamic court historians who inherited the same problem their predecessors across the Mediterranean had struggled with for generations. The language of avoidance has a grammar all its own. Unspeakable acts, That phrase, or its equivalent in whatever tongue the writer was using, appears with remarkable frequency. It is remarkable precisely because of what it does. It does not deny. It does not silence entirely. It performs a kind of announcement. There is something here, something the writer knows, something the writer has either witnessed or been told or inferred from evidence. And then, having made that announcement, it refuses to complete the sentence. Corruption of morals, another phrase that functions as a closed door with a visible handle. The historian gestures toward a space, labels it, and then declines to enter. You are meant to understand that something occurred. You are not meant to know exactly what. The label does the work of disclosure without the content following. Practices unworthy of record. This one is particularly fascinating because it reveals the double bind ancient historians found themselves in. If a practice is truly unworthy of record, you do not mention it at all. The fact that it is mentioned, that it receives even this dismissive label, means it was significant enough that ignoring it entirely would have created a different kind of gap. The historian was trapped between the obligation to acknowledge and the social prohibition against describing. So they built a new kind of sentence, a sentence that says, "I see this, I refuse to show it to you, and you should understand from my refusal that it exists." That architecture of language was not accidental, it was craft. Then there were the sacred contexts, and these present a particular challenge, because they exist at the intersection of the historian's two great loyalties, to record and to protect what was holy. Across the ancient world, from the temples of Mesopotamia to the rites of ancient Greece, from the sacred groves of Celtic practice to the ceremonial traditions documented in fragments from the Indus region, there are references to ritual practices that involve the body, that involve intimacy, that involve what we might today categorize under the broad and often anachronistic heading of sexuality. But those references exist almost entirely through a secondary lens.
The Greek historian writing about Egyptian temple practice does not describe what he claims to have heard about with anything approaching ethnographic directness. He labels it, he moralizes around it, he borrows the vocabulary of disgust to create distance from the content, even as the distance itself proves he is aware of the content. The Roman chronicler describing the customs of peoples in Asia Minor performs a similar maneuver. He is detailed about geography. He is detailed about military organization, about trade, about clothing, about food. And then, when he arrives at what he clearly considers the most significant differentiating feature of that culture's religious practice, he becomes, deliberately, structurally, vague. Things were done in those temples which modesty prevents me from setting down in full. Modesty, that word. It appears across so many ancient accounts, in so many languages, and it functions as a shield. But whose modesty? Not, it turns out, the historian's personal delicacy. The historians who used this phrase were often quite willing to describe violence in graphic terms, to record political betrayals in specific detail, to catalog the physical suffering of conquered peoples without flinching. Their modesty was selective. It was aimed at a specific category of human behavior and nowhere else. Which tells you something important. The avoidance was not temperamental. It was not about the writer's personal squeamishness. It was about what the culture of writing, the shared agreement between writer and audience, had decided was appropriate to permanently record. There is a difference between not knowing and not saying. Ancient historians were, almost universally, not ignorant of what they declined to describe. Their avoidance was informed. It was the avoidance of someone who has seen the thing and made a calculation about whether to bring the audience with them. The foreigners got it worse. If there is a consistent pattern across ancient historical writing, across cultures and centuries and languages, it is this. The practices a writer most thoroughly describes as corrupt, depraved, or sexually transgressive are almost always the practices of someone else, of the other, of the people across the river, across the sea, across the border of civilization as the writer defines it. The Roman found Greek sexual customs worth lingering over in ways he did not linger over his own.
The Greek found Persian court practices worth describing in terms he would not apply to the Athenian symposium. The Chinese court historian found the customs of border peoples worth noting in language he would not use about the educated class of the capital. The pattern is so consistent, so universal, so structurally identical across traditions that have no contact with one another that it cannot be explained as coincidence. It is a technology of moral geography.
By placing the transgression at a distance, by locating corruption in the other, in the foreign, in the barbarian, in the heretic, the writer achieves two things simultaneously. He establishes his own culture as the norm against which the other is measured and found wanting, and he gives his audience the pleasure of reading about transgression while allowing them to experience it as moral education rather than voyeurism. This is sophisticated work. It is not naive. It is a deliberate narrative strategy, refined over centuries, passed down through the simple mechanism of imitation. Young writers reading old writers, absorbing not just content but method, learning which gestures of language allowed certain kinds of material to be included without crossing the invisible line of acceptability. The result is that the ancient record is full of descriptions of other people's intimate customs, always distorted, always moralized, almost never firsthand, frequently exaggerated to the point of what we would now recognize as propaganda, while the same customs, when practiced at home, either disappear from the record entirely or appear only in legal texts describing punishments, never in narrative texts describing behavior. Silence at home, spectacle abroad. That asymmetry is itself a form of information. Now consider what power was actually doing with this silence. Marriage law in the ancient world was not primarily about love or companionship. It was about property, about inheritance, about the legitimacy of heirs, about the transfer of wealth across generations in a way that maintained the social order, which meant, above all, maintained the economic and political position of the families already at the top of that order. Female sexuality in this context was not a private matter, it was a political one. The regulation of women's bodies was inseparable from the regulation of property because a child born of uncertain parentage could not safely inherit, could not safely be acknowledged as the continuation of a lineage, could not be trusted to carry forward the name and the estate and the claim. This meant that ancient legal codes spent considerable effort defining, restricting, and punishing female sexual behavior, while almost invariably saying very little about the specific acts being regulated. The punishment is described. The crime is named in abstract. The behavior itself is not detailed. Read Roman law on adultery and you find precise specifications of penalties, of who can bring charges, of what happens to property in cases of conviction. You do not find a frank description of what adultery actually meant in practice, because the writers of that law were not in the business of describing, they were in the business of control. The silence in the legal record mirrors the silence in the historical record, and together they create something important. A world in which transgression was everywhere acknowledged and nowhere fully named. Because to fully name it would be to give it a kind of reality that the system depended on keeping theoretical. Laws against unnamed acts are, paradoxically, easier to enforce and easier to use selectively than laws against acts precisely described. A precisely described law can be challenged on its description. A law against corruption, against indecency, against behavior unbecoming, that law is infinitely flexible. It can be applied to an enemy and withheld from an ally. It can be used against a woman and ignored when a man of standing commits the same act. The vagueness is the mechanism of inequality. The silence protects not just morality, but the unequal application of morality. History knew this. The historians who wrote within these legal cultures were not naive observers of a system they didn't understand. They were participants in it. And their silences, like the silences of the legal codes they lived under, were functional. They maintained the flexibility that power required. But objects do not lie the way words can.
When archaeologists began excavating Pompeii in the 18th century, they found something that created an immediate institutional problem. They found art. Specifically, they found domestic art, frescoes, sculptures, oil lamps, ceramics, that depicted scenes the excavators' culture had no framework for displaying publicly. What the ancient texts had avoided naming, the ancient objects depicted with casual, matter-of-fact specificity. The response was not to immediately integrate this material into the public understanding of ancient Roman life. The response was to create a separate room, what became known informally as the secret cabinet, the gabinetto segreto, where this material was locked away from general viewing, accessible only to those deemed mature or scholarly enough to encounter it without being corrupted. This is one of history's more elegant ironies. Material created in ancient Rome as household objects, as everyday items, as decorative elements that required no special permission to own or view. That material became, 17 centuries later, the subject of exactly the same institutional anxiety its creators' historians had practiced. The silence didn't end with antiquity, it was inherited. What the objects reveal, even now, is the gap between official discourse and lived experience that the written record was designed to maintain. The texts said one thing about Roman life, about its moral seriousness, its discipline, its regulated propriety. The objects said something more complicated, not more depraved, not necessarily more transgressive in any meaningful sense, but more human, more specific, less interested in maintaining a performance for posterity. Burial evidence adds another layer.
The way cultures bury their dead is among the most honest evidence we have about how those cultures understood life, because burial tends to be governed by ritual rather than by the kind of social calculation that shapes written texts. What goes into a grave with the person reflects genuine belief about what that person was, what they needed, what their community thought of their life and body and relationship to the world. Burial evidence from across the ancient world, from the steppes of Central Asia, from the Mediterranean basin, from South Asia, from pre-Columbian Americas, contains information about gender, about partnership, about intimacy, about the organization of households and bodies that does not appear in the texts produced by those same cultures. Not because the texts couldn't have included it, because they chose not to. The silence of the written record around certain aspects of ancient intimate life is not evidence of absence, it is evidence of a decision, a recurring, sustained, culturally reinforced decision to keep certain realities in the realm of practice, while allowing only a sanitized or moralizing version of that practice to reach the written page. The objects and the graves know things the historians refuse to say. And then there were the copyists. Most people, when they think about ancient texts, imagine something direct, a Roman historian sitting down and writing the text we now read in translation. But the physical reality of how ancient texts survived is more complicated and more interesting. Most texts that survived antiquity did so because they were copied, repeatedly, across centuries, by hands that belonged to people with their own institutions, their own cultures, their own anxieties about content. A text written in the 1st century might survive because it was copied in the 4th century, and again in the 9th, and again in the 13th. At each of those copying moments, a human being made decisions. Some of those decisions were purely practical, a word that had become illegible, a passage that the copyist's exemplar was damaged in. But some of those decisions were editorial, deliberate, conscious choices to soften, to skip, to substitute, to reframe. Christian monasteries in medieval Europe were among the primary preservers of classical texts and among the primary filters of them. A monk copying Ovid was navigating a genuine tension between the cultural value of preserving ancient learning and the institutional requirement of protecting morality. Sometimes the text survived intact. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes it survived in a form subtly different from what was first composed, not altered dramatically enough to be obvious, but adjusted at certain edges, around certain passages, in certain sections where the original had been too specific for comfort. Political censorship operated similarly. A patron who funded a historian expected certain things not to appear. A ruler who survived a crisis preferred the historical account of that crisis to reflect well on the ruler's management.
Court historians across cultures, Roman, Byzantine, Chinese, Persian, Indian, navigated the same constraint. The people who could destroy you were also the people whose lives and courts you were recording. The silence in the record is layered. It includes the original historian's calculation, the copyist's anxiety, the patron's requirement, the institution's editorial practice across centuries. By the time a text reaches us, translated, edited, footnoted, published in a modern scholarly edition, it has passed through so many filters that what we are reading is not a window into the ancient world, but a corridor of reflections, each one slightly different from the last. What reaches us is what survived the gauntlet of all those decisions, which is an astonishing thing to sit with. And here is where a responsible engagement with this subject demands an honest reckoning, not with the ancient world, but with us. Modern culture has a complicated relationship with ancient silence. On one side, there is the legitimate scholarly project of filling in the gaps, using archaeology, comparative anthropology, material culture, legal records, linguistic analysis to build a more complete picture of what ancient texts omitted. That project is careful, evidenced, cautious. It acknowledges what is known, what is inferred, and what remains genuinely uncertain. On the other side, there is something else. There is the temptation, alive in popular media, in documentary filmmaking, in online historical content, to treat ancient silence as a blank space that imagination can legitimately fill. To move from "the historian didn't describe this" to "therefore the worst imaginable version of it must have occurred." To use the opacity of the ancient record not as a problem to carefully work through, but as a canvas on which to project modern anxieties, modern fascinations, modern narrative needs. That temptation is not neutral, it has consequences. The ancient world was not uniformly more depraved than ours, or more innocent, or more primitive, or more sophisticated. It was different in ways that require patience and rigor to understand, and those ways are genuinely interesting without embellishment. What actually occurred in ancient sacred spaces, in ancient households, in ancient courts and rituals and private lives is already strange and specific and human enough to hold attention without the addition of invented horror. Sensation-seeking projection onto ancient silence is its own form of distortion, and in some ways it mirrors the distortion it claims to be exposing. The ancient writers who exaggerated the customs of foreigners for moral effect were doing exactly what a modern storyteller does when they invent the contents of an ancient silence to maximize dramatic impact. The mechanism is the same. The effect on the audience's understanding of the past is similarly unreliable. Responsible historical reconstruction requires distinguishing between what is evidenced, what is inferred, and what is imagined. That distinction is not pedantic. It is the difference between understanding the past and simply using the past as a mirror for present preoccupations.
The evidence we have is already extraordinary. It already tells the story of power, of bias, of selective memory, of institutions shaping the record to suit their needs. That story is not less compelling for being honest. It is more compelling because it is real. Consider what we actually know. We know that ancient historians were not neutral observers. We know this because they tell us so, not directly, not in confession, but in the patterns of their writing, the consistent structures of their avoidance, the way their silences cluster around specific categories of information in ways that are clearly non-random. No natural process of time and decay would produce a record that is detailed about military strategy and consistently vague about intimate practice. That pattern required human intention. We know that writing was a tool of power, not just because powerful people commissioned histories, though they did, but because the very access to literacy, to materials, to the time and social position required to write and be copied, all of that was distributed unequally, in ways that ensured certain voices reached permanence and others did not. The voices we have are the voices that the ancient power structure decided should survive. That is not the whole story of those civilizations. It is the fraction of the story that passed through the filter. We know that silence was constructed. The specific vocabulary of avoidance, unspeakable, indecent, too shameful to name, appears too consistently across too many cultures and centuries to be accidental. Writers learned it from other writers. Copyists reproduced it. Institutions enforced it. The silence we encounter in ancient texts is not the silence of ignorance, it is the silence of deliberate omission, repeated so many times that it became the grammar of a category, a standard method for acknowledging what would not be fully shown. We know that the absent record is not the absent reality. People lived in ways that the official record did not preserve. They had customs, practices, relationships, rituals, forms of intimacy that they understood, that their communities understood, that they performed without requiring a historian's endorsement. Those lives were not less real for being unrecorded, they were simply unrecorded. And we know, because the objects and the burial evidence tell us, that the gap between the official written record and the lived reality of ancient people was often significant. What went into the grave, what was painted on the wall of the private room, what was manufactured in clay and bronze and kept in the household, all of that speaks to a life more complicated, more varied, and more human than the official narrative chose to acknowledge. That gap is the real subject of this history. Not the specific content of what was omitted, though that content where it can be responsibly recovered is genuinely interesting. The real subject is the fact of the gap itself. The fact that every major ancient civilization produced a written record that systematically sanitized certain categories of human experience. That the sanitization followed recognizable patterns, that those patterns consistently served the interests of the people doing the writing, that those interests were not neutral, not universal, not representative of all the people who lived in those civilizations. The people left out of the record did not disappear, they just didn't get to write. A woman in 1st century Rome who navigated the legal, social, and physical realities of her body in a world entirely legislated by men who had decided that her behavior was a matter of public order rather than private experience. She lived a life of considerable complexity, navigated with whatever internal resources she had against a system designed to reduce her to a function in someone else's inheritance. She did not leave a written record. What we know of her life is filtered entirely through the records of the men who legislated, moralized, and occasionally noticed her. A person in ancient Athens whose intimate life did not map cleanly onto the categories the official culture recognized, who existed in one of the spaces that the written record acknowledged only through the vocabulary of corruption and shame, that person's experience, their internal reality, their relationship to a community that had partial language for what they were, is almost entirely lost. What survives is the legal and literary framework that surrounded them, not their own voice. An initiate in a sacred ritual whose elements the officiating historians described only as foreign and indecent, that person participated in something their community understood as meaningful, as sacred, as connected to something larger than the individual. The meaning was real to them. The practice was coherent within its own framework. What we inherit is not the coherence, but the condemnation. The outsider's dismissive label applied over the insider's understanding, and the insider's understanding gone. Those erasures are losses, not just for the people themselves, they have been gone for centuries, but for us, for the completeness of our picture, for the accuracy of our understanding of what human civilization actually contained in its full variety before the filters were applied. History has always been more varied than its official record. The official record is what survived the decisions of those with the access and the power to shape permanence. What they chose to leave out, the silence they constructed with such consistent care, was not nothing. It was the life they didn't know how to face on the page, or the life they knew better than to include. There is no clean ending to a story about silence. Silence doesn't resolve. It continues. It echoes. It shapes every generation that inherits the record without inheriting the full reality the record was drawn from. What we are left with is the work of attention, the work of noticing what isn't there, of following the vocabulary of avoidance to the edge of what it conceals, of taking the objects and the graves and the legal texts and the rare unguarded moments in the historical record when a writer's careful composure slipped and something specific came through, and of treating those fragments with the care they deserve. Not sensationalizing, not inventing, not using the ancient record as raw material for modern anxieties, but understanding that every silence in the archive was a decision, that decisions are made by people with interests, that those interests shaped what we know and what we do not know, and what we assume we know because no one thought it worth noting. The ancient historians were not merely recorders, they were curators. They selected, framed, softened, omitted, moralized, and preserved, not the world as it was, but the world as they believed it should be seen. Some of what they protected with their silence was dignity, some of it was power. The difference between those two things is the most important historical question their omissions leave us with. And perhaps the most honest thing we can say, having looked carefully at where the language becomes careful, where the ink grows thin, where the ancient hand hesitated and reached instead for abstraction, is this: history is not only what was written, it is also what was carefully, deliberately, methodically left out. And in the space of that omission, if you know how to look, the true shape of the world they lived in begins, faintly, to emerge.